All right. Welcome. Thank you for coming to the New England Aquarium on this kind of blustery evening. Hopefully we'll have some nice warm tropical slides. I don't know. I haven't seen the talk yet. But welcome to our 5th lecture of the 2014 Lowell Lecture season. We appreciate the Lowell Institute, which allows us to do these lectures at no cost to you. So we greatly appreciate all of their support. And we'd also like to thank the GBH Forum Network for filming tonight's lecture. And it will be available online. Just go to the NEAQ Lectures website, and then you can find all this lecture and all of the past lectures we have. My name is Dr. Michael Telesti. I'm the Director of Ocean Sustainability Science here at the New England Aquarium. The New England Aquarium is unique because we have both an active research and conservation department where we do a lot of our own peer-reviewed science. But then what we do is we actually reach out to companies and we try to figure out how we can solve ocean problems through market-based mechanisms and that. So we do a lot of work in sustainable seafood. We partner with, again, a number of companies locally and nationally. And one thing we like to talk about in seafood is that seaweed is actually one of the most aquaculture products in the world. 50% of all aquaculture product is seaweed. So we are actually really big seaweed fans here. I know Jarrett's not probably going to talk too much about aquaculture, but so I just thought I would pass that out. So that's your random fact for the night. There you go. All right, so Jarrett is, he actually grew up in the Northeast. He did his undergraduate and he was working in the Gulf of Maine. And then he decided to be warm for his PhD, so he went out to Santa Barbara, University of California at Davis. And he's a population biologist. He looks at ecosystems. So he's been back in the Northeast for 2 years. He's faculty at the School for the Environment at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, which is near and dear to our heart because recently the University of Massachusetts and the New England Aquarium Research Department kind of joined forces. So we have cross appointments. So basically, Jarrett is one of us. So please welcome Jarrett, and and he's going to teach us all about kelpy goodness. I think that's how you put it. All right, thanks.
Okay, can you hear me? Is this on? Great, good. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for braving the elements to turn out to this lecture this evening. I'm really excited to talk to you tonight about some of the work that I do and some of the work that my colleagues do looking at kelp forest ecology and temperate reef ecology around the world. But I wanted to start with some thank yous. And I wanted to begin...
Can you turn it up a bit?
Can I turn it up?
Yes.
Could you turn it up a bit? Thank you. I wanted to begin with some thank yous. And first off, I wanted to thank Michael and the Aquarium for inviting me. This is really kind of a unique honor for me. I'm a kid that grew up in Baltimore. So here's our lovely waterfront. And actually, more specifically, I really did grow up right here at the National Aquarium in Baltimore. My mom worked there. I've been going there since I was about 4 years old and was kind of raised by the volunteer department, you might say. So this is really a unique and special honor for me to come here and talk to all of you, having been to many seminars like this at your sister institution, as it were. I'd also like to begin by thanking this group of fine ladies and gentlemen. This is the Kelp Forest and Climate Change Ecology Working Group. This was a working group that I was privileged enough to lead and take part in at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis several years ago. And many of the stories that I'll be telling tonight come from the researchers here in this group and stories that we have been weaving together, as well as, quite honestly, many of the photographs. I myself am not an amazing underwater photographer, so a lot of the photographs come from my colleagues here, as well as other photographs that I am greatly indebted to some of the wonderful marine photographers here in New England. So with that out of the way, tonight I would like to talk to you about the most interesting ecosystem in the ocean. Now you may think, oh great, he's going to tell us about some remote warm reef in the South Pacific, maybe Palau, maybe Moorea, maybe somewhere that we've just visited for the very first time. No, I'm not. Coral reefs. Been there, done that. I'm kind of bored by them, frankly. And I say this in all fairness, some of my best friends are coral reef ecologists, but you know, coral, whatever. Okay, so not coral. We're not going to talk about coral reefs. What kind of reefs are we going to talk about? Well, maybe I'm going to tell you about really exciting deep sea reefs, vent reefs, or even more exciting, maybe something like reefs formed from the bones of dead whales. And we'll talk about bone-eating snotworms and other fun things on those sorts of reefs. I really kind of wish that I was talking about that, but unfortunately I don't study this, so I won't be. I'm going to talk to you about a reef that I think is such an interesting ecosystem because for us here in Boston, this is the reef in our backyard. So if you were to look around Boston and ask, where do I find reefs? Well, they're everywhere. They really are everywhere. You can go out to just about any stretch of rocky subtidal, and there you can find something that looks like this. Majestic, beautiful, temperate reefs. And for those of you who really love this picture, I highly recommend you go and check out some of Brian Skerry's work at Cash's Ledge, an area just offshore where they photographed some just absolutely wonderful, beautiful, temperate reefs. Okay, temperate reefs. What are temperate reefs? Well, here in the Gulf of Maine, we are, I would say, fortunate to have experienced fairly recent glaciation. And as those glaciers retreated, they left behind them a seafloor that was scoured and cleaned. A seafloor of rock and cobble that was left barren and bare, exposed rock. And that exposed rock provided the substrate for life. It provided the habitat, or rather it provided the area that things like kelps could come in, could settle, could grow. Here in this wonderful cold water temperate environment, we find beautiful reefs such as this from Nova Scotia. We find a wonderful diversity of life, not just big brown kelps, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment, but red algae, tunicates, sponges, a whole variety of species, all living on the seafloors of our temperate reefs. We may see vast aggregations of species such as green sea urchins hanging out, making their living here in our temperate reefs. These ecosystems really are amazing. They are very akin to coral reefs in many ways. You may have noticed that in many of these pictures we have a conspicuous big leafy organism here. These are kelps. Kelps are big brown algae that form the foundation of these ecosystems. If you really want a coral analog within temperate reefs, it really is kelps. These big brown, and actually I would also say delicious algae are what temperate reefs are all about. And I don't say delicious facetiously. I mean, it's kind of a fun word to describe something big and juicy like a kelp. But actually I recently returned from the Maine Seaweed Festival. There is active ongoing aquaculture of kelps, and they can be used in a variety of ways. So here are just sort of two little things from the Seaweed Festival itself. Kelp dusted bagels. And ice cream actually made with kelp, and not just kelp as a thickening agent, but kelp in the ice cream. Big, delicious, salty chunks of kelp. It's a nice, sweet, salty pairing going on. So kelp, it's what's for dinner, and certainly is becoming more and more so. In fact, I would wager that almost everybody in this audience has actually already eaten kelp in one of two forms. Most commonly, you may have seen it in your seaweed salad. So if you've been out to a Japanese restaurant, gotten seaweed salad, now this doesn't look anything like kelp, but really what this is is a large blade of kelp sliced up very finely and dyed bright green. So you've probably eaten kelp already. You may have also eaten it in your miso soup, those sort of brownish green chunks of algae in there. That's kelp again, kombu. So kelp, it's a delicious, nutritious, wonderful. Some people say kelp is the new kale, and I think that's actually really great. I'll tell you more about, I will admit, I'm starting with the delicious because I'm a very food-motivated person. The students in my lab will tell you I run a food-motivated lab, so I think this is a good entry point. So kelp, it's what's for dinner, but that's not the only reason it's awesome. Kelp is amazing because it is not only here on our temperate reefs in Boston in the Gulf of Maine, but kelps are found around the globe. So shown here is just a map of the world, and what I've done, or what rather one of my colleagues has done, is outlined all of the regions around the world where the seashores are dominated by different species of kelps. This is roughly a quarter of the world's coastlines. Think about that. A quarter of our coasts dominated by kelps. Truly an important species. They're everywhere, and they're all shapes and sizes. You may find something like this lush, rolling meadow of a colonia in New Zealand. Or if you were to go up to British Columbia, you would see these beautiful, arching, tall bull kelps and the rockfish that live in them. Or go to the Aleutian Islands, where you have big, long blades of kelp stretching to the surface of the ocean. Or come to California, where you have majestic undersea redwood forests, more or less. Diving in areas like this, it's like being in a cathedral. They're amazing systems. So great. So for us, we have food. We've definitely got some aesthetic beauty. I hope I've convinced you of that. But kelps do more than just do great things for us. As I mentioned before, kelps are a foundation species. We call them a foundation species. That's actually a formal term of art, or it's a technical term, because they create the foundation of ecosystems by providing habitat. So shown here, we've got a little bit of kelp from California with some fish hanging out and living in it. Kelps are wonderful places for fish. They're wonderful places for juvenile fish. Around here, they provide all sorts of nooks and crannies for life, like lobsters, to hang out in. It's not just the rolling blades of kelp that provide that habitat. Even if you get down to kelp holdfast, so kelps live on rock, they obviously don't have roots like a land plant, but instead they have these wonderful, beautiful holdfasts that grow in and encrust into rocks. And in all of the small holes of those holdfasts, you find, actually in some places, completely unique communities of organisms, nestled in, living, making a life for themselves. So they're foundation species because they provide habitat. They're also foundation species because, well, with a big, delicious brown algae, we're obviously not the only ones eating it. Kelps provide food to everything around them. This is one of my favorite crabs. This is Pugetia producta, a color-changing kelp crab from the west coast. And you can see it's hanging out on kelp, and not only is it living in the kelp and using it as habitat, but it's also munching away. Most animals, however, don't eat live kelp. Kelp grows at an incredible rate. The giant kelp of California and Tasmania and other parts of the world can grow up to 2 feet a day. Here in Boston Harbor, out of the harbor islands, we've seen kelp growing about 1.5 feet in the span of a month in the middle of summer. So they are an incredible biomass production machine, turning it out constantly, and because of that, they're constantly sloughing off biomass. So here are some sugar kelp blades, and you can see the edges are kind of raggedy and falling apart a little bit. And that's because as kelp grows constantly, it is constantly turning that detritus out to the seafloor. And this has an incredibly profound effect. So things like sea urchins, hungry, marauding, constantly eating everything in their path, sea urchins, they're basically just kept fat and happy by sitting around and eating all the kelp detritus that falls off. So these formerly rapacious urchins just sort of lay back and laze out and eat the drift kelp as it comes by. Completely changes their personality. There are, of course, other species as well that do live off of live kelp. So you may find something like tiny snails, like Lacuna vincta, that can really do a number on live blades. Or you may find small skeleton shrimp and ghost shrimp. These animals are the base of the food chain. Small snails, small little ghost shrimps. These are the things that fish, and often some of the fish that we may well eat later, all make a living eating. So they form the base of the food chain that leads right back up to us. Not only does kelp provide services by providing habitat for organisms and providing food for organisms, all of which eventually find our way back to us, they also do all sorts of crazy things to water flow and water motion. There are some places where they've found that kelp can slow down water motion and actually slow down erosion and change beach formation. So a huge variety of both biological and physical ecosystem services all coming from kelps. So okay, I hope you have drunk the Kool-Aid at this point, and you think that kelps are awesome, and that temperate rocky reefs are where it's at. So today what I'd like to do, or tonight rather, for the rest of the evening, I would like to take a little walk around the world. And I'd like to tell you a few different stories about temperate reefs and kelp forests, and use climate change as a lens to focus our examination of just how amazing these ecosystems are. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the story of kelp beds and forest here in New England. And I'm going to use this to raise a number of questions about what do we need to know about how climate change may affect kelp beds in the future. I'll then take a step over to Australia and start to answer those questions by telling you a little bit about what we have seen in terms of changes in kelp abundances due to different climate drivers in Australia. And then I'll wrap up by talking a little bit about California. I'll start to talk about some other effects of climate change that are a little bit less intuitive, but nonetheless really interesting, and provide us a jumping off point to think about some future efforts. Okay, so let's begin with New England. It is, after all, our homegrown ecosystem. New England is host to a variety of kelps that form, as I've mentioned before, these sort of lush, I keep saying lush and rush, they're very similar. These lush rolling meadows. They're kind of like the prairie of the deep sea, or the shallow sea really, since this is typically around, between 15 to 40, 50 feet deep. There are a wide variety of species, and they all form large rolling meadows like this meadow of sugar kelp, Saccharina latissima. And the story of kelp beds is an interesting one. Pre-1970s, this is what a lot of the seafloor looked like. However, as we're all familiar, in the 70s and 80s, a number of different predatory fish species were slowly taken out of the system. So as we had declines in the abundances of predatory fish species, the things they ate, those fat, happy, detritus-feeding sea urchins, started to build up in population. And they built up more and more and more until they could not be satisfied. At which point, the Gulf of Maine flipped. So from about the 1980s to the early 1990s, this is what a lot of the seafloor looked like. A moonscape, a barren of urchins. So you can see in this picture a lot of sort of small dots or small spiky balls. These are all sea urchins who have created this barren habitat. So from about the 80s to the 90s here in New England, we were a fairly barren-dominated system in a variety of areas. Now there were remnant patches here and there, particularly in areas with high wave exposure. Urchins don't like waves, they tend to get blown off of rocks. But a lot of the Gulf looked like this. Moving forward in time, as urchins built up those populations, a couple of different things began to kick in to control them. And so we had this trifecta in the 1990s. In the north of the Gulf, in some areas, particularly due to warming waters, a disease moved in. And as many of you who are familiar with the story of diadema in the Caribbean may remember, at high densities of sea urchins, disease can really do a number on the population. So there's this amoeba in the north of the Gulf around Nova Scotia that really can caused serious population declines of urchins. At the same time, an urchin fishery also developed here in the Gulf of Maine. So what was formerly the herbivore that was free from any human pressure suddenly became the target of human pressure. So that drove their densities down as well. And last, with all those predatory fishes being gone, we experienced what's called mesopredator release. In other words, things like Jonah crabs or rock crabs that are kind of in the middle of the food chain were released from predation. Now, these guys aren't really good at eating big adult sea urchins, but they sure do love small juvenile sea urchins. If you were to give this rock crab here, or sorry, this Jonah crab here, a bunch of juvenile sea urchins, they would plow through it like a bag of popcorn. So we had 3 different urchin control vectors kick in into the 1990s, which sounds great from the perspective of kelp. It sounds like, all right, urchins, they're under control. We're going to go back to the good old pre-70s days of nice big kelp forests. And to some extent that's happened. There are a number of places where big kelp beds have come back. But at the same time, all of that barren space was there and waiting to be colonized, which has led to a variety of other species moving into the ecosystem. So this is a shot that we took out in Salem Sound, or actually no, this is out at Appledore Island a few years ago, and you can see this red algae all over the place. This is an invasive alga, Heterosiphonia japonica, which in some places forms what I like to call the red shag carpet from hell. Also down below, you can see something hanging off the side of the wall. This is a colonial sea squirt, also invasive, not native to the Gulf of Maine. Here's another view of it. This is something whose common name I think is actually pretty apt. Some people like to call this rock vomit. And there are areas where this has formed vast colonies in different places within the Gulf as well. All is not doom and gloom, however. The Gulf of Maine, I find, is a really interesting case study in vitality. What we have, instead of just giant, big, invasive-only areas or giant, big kelp forest, we have this patchwork mosaic on the seafloor of a wide variety of algae and invertebrates. It's kind of anybody's guess what's going to happen next. And so my lab's actually had a great time hanging out and starting to study the kelp. So this is a photo of Team Dive from the Byrnes lab last summer when we were out at the Shoals Marine Lab. This is what some of the kelp looked like, not only here, but out at the Harbor Islands last summer. It was a summer of big, fat, large kelps. What does that mean, though? What is the future of kelp forests here in the Gulf of Maine, particularly given that we are watching waters warm? We're watching things warm up. We're watching new species start to make their way around the Gulf. What does the future hold? Well, I wish I knew. I'm pretty glad I don't, because that keeps me interested and keeps me in research. But we can look at other systems around the world to start to understand what may the future hold for here in the Gulf of Maine. So I'm going to move us around the world now to Australia. So this is a map of Australia and the ocean. The colors on this map signify sea surface temperatures. Most of you, I'm sure, when you think of Australia, think of the Great Barrier Reef, first off. And sure, there are corals there too. Sorry I'm hating on corals, but you know, corals, great, okay. Australia's way cooler than that. And that's because starting at that green band and moving on down, the waters are cooler. And so those are areas where we actually begin to get kelps. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a story of climate change in Western Australia, and then I'll talk to you a bit about what's going on in Tasmania. Both have different things to teach us. So let's start with Western Australia, just off of Perth. The kelps in this system are really amazing. They're kind of like these miniature palm trees. So when you go down and take a look around, it's like you're in a tiny bonsai palm forest. And sure enough, much like kelps here and in other systems, they're creating a huge amount of habitat. So if you peer under that forest canopy, which is maybe about as high as your knee, you see a riot of life. Again, fish, crabs, lobsters, urchins, invertebrates. It's a mini habitat, all hanging out under that kelp canopy. Other fish swim around on top. It's a really beautiful system. One of the really cool things about looking at this sort of kelp's eye view is it begins to show us something very important about kelp. We're all focused in on, of course, the stipes, or stems, if you will, if you want to trust on that log, but these kelp stipes sticking up and all the blades at the top of the adult kelps. And adult kelps are really amazing. They're incredibly resilient. Often they'll do things like store up nutrients in those thick woody stipes so that they can ride out any major disturbance event. One of the really cool things about Western Australia is that as you move up Western Australia and looking at the temperate reefs there, you start to grade into the tropical. And in fact, Western Australia, based on what's going on in ocean currents in a given year, can experience these extreme warm water incursion events. So warm waters will kind of shoot down the coast, much like we get cores spinning off the Gulf Stream here. They'll bring tropical fish, other tropical species coming along with them. And normally that's okay. The adult kelps are pretty resilient to these warmer tropical waters shooting through the system. Maybe some will die, but they're pretty good at recovering. They don't just recover from adults, but as you can see here, you have this sort of rocky seafloor, and on that rocky seafloor are a very particular life history phase of kelps. Let's refer to them as sort of kelp seeds. So kelps actually put out these, if you will, seeds that hang out as a microscopic stage living on a rock. You'll go out to these areas and you'll find rocks that are absolutely blanketed with tiny, tiny little microscopic kelp seeds. We call them gametophytes. Seeds kind of an easier way to think about them because they do indeed generate a seed bank just like a terrestrial plant seed bank. So if one of these warm water incursions comes through, a lot of the adults will survive. Obviously some will die, but that's okay. Kelp can regenerate from that seed bank. It turns out, though, that as climate change has progressed and waters around Western Australia have warmed, that while adults are okay with the slowly warming waters, it's the seed bank that really suffers. These are the more sensitive life history stages of kelps. So we've seen mortality of these microscopic stages. And because of that, when you have areas like this, so this is a reef off of Western Australia, and this is in November 2010, right before one of these warm water incursions came through. This was a particularly strong one, and it did indeed kill back a lot of kelp, but because the seed bank was not as strong, those kelps weren't able to recover. So this is 1 year later, and you see there are a variety of bare spaces, a lot of gaps in the canopy, and that's because those are areas where kelp was not able to regrow. And in fact, within this system, as things warm up and then we get these periodic warm water incursion events, which have become more and more frequent as extreme weather events become more and more frequent from climate change, there's some real possibility that what we're watching is the gradual tropicalization of a temperate reef. That warm water fishes may move in, that corals may move in even. There are hints, signs. How the future is going to play out is an open question, but we're starting to see these dramatic shifts in some places along the west. So okay, that's one way that warm waters may work. Warming waters may actually alter kelp seed banks, and in so doing, they may alter the resiliency of these ecosystems to big disturbance events from something like climate change. I'd like to move us down to the south and start to talk about a different way that warming waters can alter kelp forests. So down at the south end of Australia, we see the smaller, I don't say island, but the smaller area of Tasmania. Tasmania is a really interesting ecosystem. Not only does it have a Clonia radiata, as well as a variety of other algae, but in Tasmania you also find the giant kelp, Macrocystis. This is the same giant kelp that those of you who have been to California before have seen. It's the same giant kelp that we actually see all around the world. It's pretty incredible how widely distributed it is. Giant kelp in Tasmania is in trouble. Since about the 60s or 70s, they've experienced roughly an 80-85% loss of giant kelp. In fact, giant kelp habitats have been declared endangered within Australia. Why is that? There are a lot of different causes, but one which has had the most dramatic visual impact comes again from warming waters. So if we look at this map and we look at the gap between southern Australia and Tasmania, you can see that as we move into Tasmania, it gets cooler. And that cold water, much like the cold water we see around the Cape here, provides a barrier to the larvae of a lot of species. So one species that up until recently, when the water has warmed and that larval barrier has begun to break down, that has not been able to jump the gap, is the black urchin, Sanchez. As waters have warmed, the larvae of these guys coming from South Australia have been able to move across and start to colonize Tasmania. And as they did that, ecologists working in Tasmania began to see a change. So this is a photograph taken by a remotely operated vehicle that swam back and forth across a reef, probably about the size of this room. So if you will, picture this as a top-down view of this room. And it looks like a big boulder field. But you'll notice that within that boulder field, there are a lot of black dots. So I'll highlight a few just with red circles. Those black dots are all sea urchins. So as sea urchins have made their way across the gap, they've been able to transform kelp forests into urchin barrens, just like I told you about previously here in the Gulf of Maine. Why is that? Is it just that the ecosystem was completely unprepared for urchins to move in? Well, no. A lot of the species in Tasmania were used to urchins already, at least over on the coast of mainland Australia. One of the big things that's interacted with these warming waters is the removal of large spiny lobsters. Tasmania has begun to implement some marine reserves, and within these marine reserves, there's no lobster fishing. So here's one of my collaborators holding one of the lobsters they pulled out of one of the reserves. You can see they're huge. Within these marine reserves, the lobsters do what they're supposed to do. They eat the urchins. And by eating the urchins, kelp has allowed the room to recover. So we have this really interesting interaction between warming waters, allowing urchins to move into the ecosystem, and human impacts from removing lobsters in the system. And those two combined have led to changes in the state of this ecosystem, transforming it from kelp forests into barrens in many areas. So Australia gives us two really interesting lessons about what climate change can potentially do to a temperate reef and to kelp forests. That warming temperatures on their own actually don't often do a lot, that they may alter the biology or physiology of one or another organism, but on their own, it's hard to observe a direct impact of that slowly warming water that we see due to climate change. But when you add some other element of disturbance, either something like a heat wave, which may increase in frequency due to climate change, or something like human pressures, that the results can be less kelp. So it's not just the impact of warming waters alone, it's whole changes to the ecosystem. It's interactions between different changes. Okay. So that's warming. I'd like to take a step back and think about some of the other aspects of climate change. We've talked about heat waves and the potential for an increase in the frequency of intense, strong weather events in the future. So let's take a step back to the United States. And let's start to talk about California. Because California provides a wonderful test bed for another example of how climate change may impact temperate reefs and kelp forests in the future. So California, much like Tasmania was, is dominated by the giant kelp, Macrocystis. There are a variety of other species there. In fact, as you move far north, you get another big canopy-forming kelp, bull kelp. You have some smaller kelps. I'll be honest, California is really a kelpy wonderland. It's a fun place to work. One thing I'd like to point out to you in this system is it's almost immediately obvious some of the importance that giant kelp plays here. You see fish swimming around, you see a variety of invertebrates on the seafloor. You really see that what giant kelp does in this ecosystem is it provides the stage on which the entire food web can play. And that concept of a food web living inside of a kelp forest is going to come back in just a minute to be quite important. The other thing you may notice is that all of this kelp is kind of leaning over, it's kind of cantilevered over, and that's because a wave is passing by. Oh, well, that's interesting. So waves start to move around kelp. So what happens if a kelp forest is hit by a really big wave? So this is a photograph from the '97 El Nino, and after big storm waves from the 97 El Nino blew through, we saw scenes like this. So this is from a beach near Santa Barbara, near UC Santa Barbara. And you can see that the kelp forest quite literally has come to the shore. So these kelps have been ripped up, pushed inshore by waves, and then deposited onto the beach. All right, well, that's a really big change. What happens after that kelp goes away? Well, there are a lot of possible answers to that question, and a lot of different ways that these kelp forests and temperate reefs can transform. One is, I've talked to you a lot about urchins, and in particular urchins in California. Those guys, they live the life. They are lazy. They sit around eating kelp, growing 2 feet a day, raining down on them. They even kind of burrow right down in the rock so they can sit and have their ideal place to eat kelp detritus. But take the kelp away and don't let it recover quickly enough, and you get grazing fronts. So again, you see barren formation in some of these areas after a very large storm, in particular if the water stays warm so that kelps don't recover, as we saw in some areas after particularly large El Niños. So that's one possibility. But California is a pretty wild place, and there are a lot of other possibilities as well. There are a lot of other states, if you will, that the ecosystem can transform into. So maybe you get an urchin barren. Maybe you get a brittle star barren. So these are arms of brittle stars in a dense, thick mat reaching up and feeding on particles as they pass by. Or, I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with sea cucumbers. I think they're in some of the exhibits here. You can actually get cucumber barrens. So these are little guys, these little Pachythione rubra. They're about yay big, and they brood and reproduce. And actually, after a number of years of fairly calm conditions in a row, you'll start to get these cucumber barrens breaking out. They're really weird. They're just weird. They're cucumber barrens. I love them. So that's another possibility. I was really curious when I was in Southern California, what might happen if we get an increase in the frequency of extreme wave events. If you look at a lot of climate models, and actually buoy data has borne this out, in many places around the US, we're seeing that we're getting big waves more frequently. It's not that we're getting like monster waves or anything like that, but climate models predict that on average you should get a sort of a shift in the distribution of waves that you're getting. You should get big waves coming through more frequently than you used to. So I went and did some modeling and did some experiments and began to look at this and found that one of the other common transitions that you get, in particular if big waves come through year after year, if we start to have very large disturbance events becoming the new normal, is that you can transition from a kelp forest seen at the top to an algae bed at the bottom. The kelp forest at the top is a photograph taken that extends from the seafloor up. This is about 30 feet in depth. So those are about 30, 35 foot tall kelps. The algae bed at the bottom, that comes up to, again, about my knee. It's sort of a scrubby bed of algae. There are some what we call sub-canopy kelps in there, but the productivity of this system is incredibly different. The rules of biology are incredibly different. The whole ecosystem has changed. And in fact, what my research has shown is that in these systems, the food web, stretching from algae on up to large predators, tends to collapse down and become very simple. So we get a whole change in the ecosystem due to multiple repeated kelp removal events. It's a really different state. Is it the future or is it not? It's hard to say. And for me, I find that, again, really exciting. There's a lot of ongoing research looking at, okay, how do those wave events play out? And I just talked about waves. How would they play out with changes in sea surface temperature? How do they play out with changes in acidification? How frequent are these storms going to be? What is the future of the ecosystem? A lot of questions. But we're starting to get some answers that waves really play a key role. And perhaps they do here as well. So okay, I've walked you through a couple of different ecosystems, talked about climate change in a couple of different contexts. I'm hoping at this point that you've got a few questions. And so questions you might have to feed into your brain, or questions I'd like you to have. First, I hope I've convinced you that these ecosystems are pretty awesome. And the first question is, how can I check out these amazing ecosystems? Second, and this comes up at a lot of talks that I give about things like climate change and climate impacts, is what can I do to help? And not just change behavior or do the myriad of things that I know everyone in this room does in order to try and minimize their climate impacts, but are there kind of unique and interesting things I can do to think about helping kelps or kelp forest science progress in the future and think about climate change? And the answer is yes. So let's actually start with the first question. Getting into temperate reefs. I'm going to be an evangelist for a minute. Get out there. Get certified and go dive, or at least get in the water in the summer and go snorkel. It's a little chilly here, but I'll be honest, it gets warmer here than it does in a lot of places. I was in California. We have nice, warm, late summers. It's a great time to get in the water and look around. So get out there. Put your face in the water. Find an area that you like and just go there once, twice, 3 times a year. Start to develop your own sense of the natural history of these temperate reefs in your backyard. The only way we can see change is if we look for it. If we go out one day and say, oh, well, this is what our reefs look like. I guess that's the way they always have been. We don't have any sense of their history. So start looking, and start looking now. Second, if you want to help, there's actually something you can do for me. And this comes from a project that I collaborated on with a brilliant scientist who's actually just starting at UCLA, a guy named Kyle Cavanaugh. And Kyle, as a graduate student, figured out a way that we can see kelp from space. So this is a photo. It's been doctored a little bit, but this is a photo from the Landsat satellite of Santa Barbara. And Landsat's it's a series of satellites, but it has been circling the globe since the early 1980s and taking pictures of every spot around the planet about every 16 days. If you chop those up into small kind of human viewable images, that means we have hundreds of thousands to millions of images of all of the places around the world that kelp might be. And if we look at them just the right way, we can see giant kelp, Macrocystis. Giant kelp that is in Tasmania, giant kelp that is in California, giant kelp that is in the Falklands, that's in Chile, that's in Argentina, that's in South Africa, that's in all of these islands that dot the southern oceans north of Antarctica. One of the really wild things about giant kelp is that we actually have no idea how it's been changing in abundance across the planet over the last 30 years. I mean, sure, divers have been going to some of the same places, in some cases for 40, 50, 60 years or longer. But those are just one reef. Those are just one place. We don't know where all of the giant kelp is. We don't know if it's been there for a long time, if it's not been there for a long time. We don't know if it's disappeared, if it's come back. We just don't know. And so what Kyle was able to do is to see the kelp. But then we ran into a problem. He wanted to say, oh, great, it's great, it's images. I have hundreds of thousands to millions of images. I bet with modern computational technology, I can just feed this into a computer, it can look at the images, it can tell me where the kelp is, and I can start to understand how kelp has changed over time, over the past 30 years. So we can begin to see, has there been any sort of global climate change signal? But it turns out, while you can see kelp from space, it's really hard to see from space. And in fact, it looks like a lot of other things. And so up until now, we've just had a cadre of probably very tired undergraduates who've been sorting through these pictures. And that's not a very good way to start looking at global distributions of kelp. It's been a good way to look at the distribution of kelp in Santa Barbara, or maybe a little bit further up the coast in California. But to go global, we need you. So in collaboration with the citizen science wing of the Adler Planetarium, Zooniverse, we've recently launched a site called Zooniverse, or called Floating Forests. And what Floating Forest is, it's a collection of all of the images that we have of giant kelp around the world from the early 80s to the present. And we're slowly feeding in more images. This is really a way that you can take a virtual field trip and see where kelp is around the planet. So we have this really slick little interface. I have to say that the Zooniverse team has been amazing, where you can look at an image like this, where maybe you can see the green at the bottom of the picture. That's a kelp bed. And all we want you to do is circle it. And if you do that and go on and look at progressively more and more images, first off, you get to look at, say, the coastline of islands that dot the Southern Ocean north of Antarctica. How often do you do that? Maybe you can take a virtual field trip down to Chile. Maybe you can look at Baja and watch forests there grow and change as they're hit by successive waves of El Niños. We've actually already begun to see the change in giant kelp in Tasmania, just looking at some of the really preliminary data we have. We actually had a lot of people come to the site very early on, look at Tasmania and say, I'm really bored, I don't see any kelp here. And that's because there was no kelp in the images we were showing them, because those were images from the last couple of years. And so we fed in more images and older images, and sure enough, back in the 80s, there you go, kelp. So if you're interested, I'm happy to talk to any of you about this. We're building educational materials and other things around this site. But really, if you spend a little bit of time on it, it's highly addictive, so I'll warn you, be ready to get some time sucked away from you. But it's a huge help. And we're also always there to talk, so if you want to chat with me online afterwards, this is where to do it, Floating Forests. Okay. Well, I'd like to leave you with 3 take-home messages. So I've given you some answers to how can I get into temperate reefs, and that is get into temperate reefs. Get out there next summer. And I've told you a little bit about how you can help by starting to help us with some of the climate change science. But 3 things I want you to walk away from this talk with are, first, I hope I've convinced you that temperate reefs are pretty awesome. They're really dynamic, amazing ecosystems. Go visit some of them. Check them out. You won't be disappointed. They're just fascinating places. Second, there is the phrase that has floated around at the main seaweed festival that kelp is the new kale and a little bit prettier than kale to boot. So I hope if you walk away from here, maybe you'll go and you'll Google, hey, how do I make a kelp berry smoothie? Because they're delicious. I promise, they really are. And last, I hope you've all gotten a sense that climate change could have some pretty strong effects to these temperate reefs in our backyard. That it behooves us to look a little bit more closely and begin to understand how temperate reefs may be growing, changing, and responding to climate change as it goes forward in our oceans. So thanks again for braving the crazy weather outside. I'm kind of curious to go out in a few weeks and see what it's done to some of the sites we're monitoring. So thank you very much. Yeah, and we've got time for questions. Yes, in the back.
How do you actually find where kelp is around here? How far off, I just wanted to swim out, how far out, how far deep is it? And
Sure.
where in the Harbor Islands can I find
Yep,
it?
yep.
I'm gonna do scuba diving.
Yeah. So kelps around here typically, some kelps come all the way up into the sort of lower intertidal. But typically you'll find them like around 10, 15 feet is where you see they start to form these beds. And they'll go down to, depending on the species, some species like shotgun kelp will actually get quite deep. So 40, 50, 60 feet. But yeah, just snorkeling, like if you go out to, I'm spacing on the name of the beach. If you go out to, say, some of the beaches off of Nahant and snorkel around the rocks there, you'll see kelp. If you go really just about anywhere that has rocky subtidal, or sort of it's rock down there and not sand, you'll see, that is a temperate reef, and you'll probably see a bunch of different kelps there, as well as other species. Yeah, next question.
You're saying that kelp is the new kale. Are you saying then that really is nutritionally as good for you as kale? And if so, where do you buy it?
So first off, there are a variety of places you can buy kelp. If you even go to like H Mart, you can get kombu and a variety of different dried species of kelp and use those in cooking. There are a bunch of really good algal cookbooks out there. I'm trying to remember, there's a really good one from Ireland that has a variety of recipes for kelp as well as other species. It's actually a really interesting time. So at the main Seaweed Festival, in the morning there was a session called the Seaweed Scene. And a number of the different producers, so there's an active and growing kelp aquaculture industry up there, so people that are farming kelp on ropes One of the reasons it's great is it's actually a winter crop. So they're talking about things like, yeah, you can fish in the summer, and then in the winter you can farm kelp. And so it's a way of providing a more sustainable living. And so they've been struggling with trying to find different markets beyond just the sort of traditional dried kelp markets. So there's one producer up there in particular, whose name is again eluding me, who's actually starting to sell undried kelp and starting to use it in different places. So if you go to somewhere like Island Creek Oyster Bar around here, you may see kelp figured into some of the dishes. What? Can you eat it if you just pull it out of the ocean? Yeah. You may want to, it's going to be real salty, so you may want to pull it out of a good place in the ocean. You may want to give it a little freshwater rinse first, but yeah. It's delicious. Yes?
Getting back to the satellite photos.
Sure.
So is that always macrocystis floating on the surface that you see in those images?
That's a great question. So the question is, when we look at our satellite images, I really focused on giant kelp macrocystis, and is that always what we're seeing? And the answer is we're not sure. So we've so far only focused those images on places where it's macrocystis forming the canopy. One of our goals within floating forests is that we are looking at areas of the coast that do have macrocystis, but that also have other species as well. So for example, as you move up the coast of California, you get into areas where you have bull kelp, Cystis, which is much more dominant. So we don't actually know how well some of these other species are represented in the satellite images. So by participating in this, you're actually helping us to see, is this limited to just macrocystis, or are there other species that we can begin to include in this as well? And it looks like, if you pull up Google Earth, it looks like some of these species, the answer might be yes. It may be that some species we can see from the surface. Other species are a little bit more tide dependent. So at this point, while we may see them periodically, if the tides were right when a satellite came over, it may not always be possible. It's an ongoing research question. Just what can we see? How far can we push the technology? And by participating, you're helping us answer that. Yes?
Going back to what someone said back there about sustainable seafood,
Mhm.
do we take these opportunities to go into more sustainable seafood with the sea urchins? Because you said they're a lot, they're used a lot in Japanese cuisine.
So you're asking about sustainability in terms of urchin fisheries?
Well, urchin fisheries, and even say how about the kelp by not taking native seaweeds and taking like you said, the red seaweeds that are grown.
So I guess is your question, what's the right kelp, what's the right algae to harvest if you're going to do it sustainably? And that's a really interesting question. We were actually having a discussion about this over dinner. And there's still a lot of active debate about what is the right way to harvest kelps in a sustainable manner. To what extent can you use wild harvest? Does wild harvest have impacts? To what extent should we be doing just rope culture? Can rope culture actually have impacts or not have impacts? And a lot of those are open questions. For me, they're exciting because they're open research questions. But they also dovetail a lot into other very practical questions. So for example, questions like, does wild harvest have an impact? Well, for me, that's really interesting because then you start to get at, oh, that's talking about kelp removal. What else removes kelp? Oh, things like storms, things like climate impacts. So the two dovetail very nicely. I think the jury's still out on a lot of that. There are certainly a lot of different ideas in the literature, and it's one of those great areas where I think we need to look at it much more intensely to determine what is the most sustainable way to actually harvest kelps. Yes? Right there.
Do you find any kind of impact for ocean acidification, so pH?
So I didn't talk about ocean acidification this evening. And ocean acidification does play into the story. OA, or ocean acidification, can affect temperate reefs in a variety of different ways. One thing it can do is it can actually have effects on calcifying organisms. So things like urchins actually have a calcified test. So you may, there's been the urchins are a funny story. There's been a lot of research from a couple of different labs on the West Coast about to what extent will things like ocean acidification affect sea urchins. And the results are mixed. In some cases, there are some dramatic impacts on juveniles, and in other cases, those impacts don't end up playing out a lot in later life history stages. Ocean acidification can also have effects potentially on things like calcified crustose coralline algae. And those coralline algae, so if you were to dive out here or to go and see a temperate reef here in Massachusetts and look underneath the kelp canopy, you'll find kind of a bevy of pink covering the rock. And those are coralline algae, and that's another potential place where something like ocean acidification may have an impact. Last, and I think this is sort of, for me, one of the most interesting stories, I talked about the invasive red algae here in the Gulf of Maine. There's actually something very similar happening in South Australia. And what they've begun to show there is that it's not acidification per se, but rather it's the increase in CO2 concentrations in the seawater, or rather increases in CO2 concentrations in the seawater around areas in South Australia could shift the balance of competition between kelps and these red turfs. So it's this idea that they've done these beautiful, beautiful experiments in chambers of seawater that they've been able to manipulate the amount of carbon dioxide in the water. And they found that if they add carbon dioxide, kelps, which are typically competitively superior, tend to become less competitively dominant, and these reds tend to do better. So OA, I think, is an area where, again, there's a lot of research to be done on what impacts it will have in temperate ecosystems. It's somewhere where we're starting to get some answers, and the answers are often really interesting because what impacts ocean acidification may have depend often on the context of the food web and the organisms that are being affected, and then how all of the organisms that connect to them are in turn affected. So it's this really interesting chain of direct and indirect effects. That, and as we're talking about climate change, changes in ocean acidification don't happen independently. You also get changes in ocean temperature simultaneously. So there's some beautiful, beautiful work coming out of Chris Harley's lab at the University of British Columbia showing that as you change temperature, you actually change the rates of metabolism of some of these organisms. And so that can actually alter how they respond to changes in acidification. And in some cases, ameliorate some of the impacts, and in other cases, exacerbate some of them. So it's a much more interesting and complex story in temperate ecosystems than sort of the simple OA story that we hear in other places. It's, I think, a pretty exciting area for research. Yes?
One more question.
You mentioned an organism that helped to control the urchin population in the urchin barrens in the Gulf of Maine. Is that organism present other places, for example, in California or Tasmania, where urchin barrens are occurring?
Okay. So just turn your question a little bit. Why do urchin barrens happen? Is it always the same organism place after place that controls sea urchins, or the same kind of organism that controls them? That's actually a fun topic of some debate, and I was fortunate enough to be part of a working group several years ago asking how common are these strong, what we call top-down effects, where predators control their prey that control kelps in temperate reefs. The classic story comes to us from the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. So in the Aleutians, the Russian fur trade swept through in the 1800s and really extirpated otters from a lot of the range, all the way from the Aleutians down into California. Now we're seeing a dramatic increase in the abundance of otters. In Alaska, this elimination of otters really led to a boom in urchin populations. Otters were the thing that were controlling urchins in the Aleutians. Once they were lost, urchins went hog wild yet again, and were able to denude the area and turn a lot of the Aleutian Islands into urchin barrens. There were some remnant populations, however, and as those remnant populations of sea otters recovered and grew and began to spread across the Aleutians, they began to eat and control sea urchins, and kelp forests were able to recover. The story in California is similar but more complex, and it's an area of a lot of argument between some scientists. Otters definitely play a role. If you go to somewhere like Monterey, where otter populations have recovered, urchin abundances are way down. But there are a lot of other ecosystems around the world that don't have otters. Lobsters are a common driver in other systems, so spiny lobsters down either in Southern California or spiny lobsters more over in somewhere like Tasmania. That's a strong driver of urchin control. Lobsters here actually for a while were proposed as a candidate urchin control agent, but it's actually found our lobsters not so much. They're really more detritivores than they are urchin predators. So who controls urchins changes from ecosystem to ecosystem to ecosystem. And I could really talk about this all night. But there's a really cool element of evolutionary history into it. So did predators show up first or did urchins show up first? And who showed up first in evolutionary history actually determines whether urchins can be controlled at all. Did urchins show up first or did kelps show up first? Who showed up first will actually determine whether or not kelps even care about urchins or whether urchins really can be a strong control agent. So there's a really dynamic interplay of evolution, of the local ecology, of impacts like fishing, of behavior. A lot of the sea urchins on the west coast, if you throw a giant, they have these stars on the west coast called pycnopodia or sun stars. They can get quite large. If you throw those into a middle of an urchin bed, the urchins run away and they change their behavior completely. So it's a really interesting story with a lot of different predators and a lot of different systems. And it just so happened that here in the Gulf of Maine, it appears that what was doing the controlling was fish. We're good? I will take any questions afterwards. I'm, of course, always happy to talk more about temperate reefs and kelp forests. I want to thank you all again, both for such a warm welcome and also for spending your time with me here this evening talking about temperate reefs. Thank you.